Thank you very much, Deline, and once again, welcome to all our guests tonight at this SHR at Home webinar. And this evening we are very fortunate to have an expert with a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience and about alien invaders in the Kruger National Park. And it is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Llewellyn Foxcroft. Llewellyn is based in the Kruger National Park, and he has worked on invasive alien species for more than 25 years. I can still remember my first contact with alien invaders was when the SHR had its own AEIG group, the IEG group, the Alien Invader Eradication Group. And I remember those guys in those days. I saw the reports and they worked really hard to get rid of aliens, invaders in the Kruger National Park. In my mind, alien invaders then was plants only. But I'm so much looking forward to Llewellyn's talk tonight, because Llewellyn is going to spread his net wide and also include other alien invaders in the Kruger National Park. And what's also interesting is that Llewellyn is not only interested in the species itself, but his interest lies in the ecological dynamics of these invasive alien species. And also quantifying the long-term impacts of biodiversity and ecosystems of these species on the ecosystems. His work also includes bridging the gap between scientific knowledge, management strategies, and policy. And I think that in my view, can almost be the toughest job, portion of his job. Llewellyn is also a lead author on the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and specifically on the assessment of invasive alien species. And with that, Llewellyn, I would like to hand over to you. You can start your video. Looking forward to listen to you and to listen to a really informative talk. Welcome to the SHR, to you as well. And with this, I'm handing over to you, Llewellyn.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks, Philly, for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen.
Llewellyn, while you're sharing, may I just at this stage just ask all the participants, if you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A section of the webinar and not in the chat section. We are only going to deal with questions in the Q&A section. Sorry for the interruption, Llewellyn.
No problem. Thanks for the invitation to share some information on biological invasions in Kruger National Park this evening. I'm going to cover generally the status of invasions, as mentioned, plants, but also animals, and look at some of the threats that they're posing, and also some of the management options or management programs that we have running in the park. So, I'm just going to give a short roadmap through the presentation. I'll start with some background context, and then the management programs, some new species and the spread of species that we were worried about, invasive alien animals, and then a very brief summary. So I think all of you are probably familiar with the big question, why are we worried about biological invasions? But we know that it's a global threat, and the IP-based report, the Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, highlighted this in a number of places. And I've just picked a few statements from them. Invasive species are increasing, negative impacts on biodiversity and nature. The rate of introduction is increasing. It's never been higher, and it certainly shows no signs of slowing. Global declines in biodiversity and nature, and one of the direct drivers, there's a number of drivers, but one of them has been highlighted as invasive species. And in this report, they sampled about 21 countries, and in those countries which have good detailed data, they show that invasive species have risen by 70% since the 1970s. And substantially severe impacts on native species on islands and in areas with high endemic species richness, and even on mainland assemblages. So it's a wide phenomenon. It's a global area, and there's almost nowhere in the globe that's not at risk of invasive species. And for those of you that are interested, just to note, the IPBES assessment on invasive alien species and their control will be released in early September this year. So I'm just going to start with a broad perspective. So we've look at the total sandparks estate, the 21 national parks. And obviously all the national parks have invasive species in and need to be managed. And of course, there's only limited resources, and the challenge is how to spread those resources across the national parks in a way that makes it that makes the most out of the resources that we do have. And if we look at the financing, and this is funding from Working for Water, which I'm sure many of you know, alien clearing program. You can see most of the funds being spent in Garden Route, Kruger, Table Mountain, and then also Gullis and Adder. Now, although Kruger is the biggest park and it certainly gets a large portion of the money, the other protected areas occur in very high in areas with very high endemic species richness, and widespread invasion. Obviously, the impact that can occur in those areas is quite severe, so that proportionally there's a large amount of funding. But when we looked at other sources of funding that have been spent in Kruger as well, we saw that the funds that have been spent over the last 20 years, so this was up to 2016, was about 350 million rand. And that includes funding from Kruger itself, from other alien clearing programs, and then the Working for Water program. So this is a huge amount of money, and you can see how much effort and resources have been invested in clearing plants at this stage, mainly plants around the park.
Llewellyn, may I just interrupt? My apologies for that. Apparently the sound is not coming through well to all the participants. May I perhaps ask you to just stop your video and maybe just speak up a bit. We've had quite a number of participants complaining about sound not coming through well. Thank you.
Okay. Sure. Let's try, hopefully it's a bit clearer. So Kruger is a large national park. You're all aware of that, but it's still an island within a broader landscape. And of course, the landscape around the park determines a large amount of what invasive species occur in the park. And there's a large number of different land use types, and this is just a simplistic view of it, where we've got high intensity urban areas, nature reserves, different land use from agriculture to pasture to commercial forestry. All these different land use types have got different invasive species associated with them and different densities of them. And when you overlay this on a river network, as we know, rivers are one of the primary conduits for invasive species spreading. You can see that there's a number of large rivers that flow from many hundred kilometers away from the park that go through all these different land use types and can bring with them many different species. You can also see that there's a large road network along which alien plants can disperse. Now, obviously, we also have a road network in Kruger, although it's a very small portion of the land surface in the park, and at this stage it appears not to be a primary conduit of invasion, except for one or two species. But you can see there's a large network around the park and spreading into the park that needs to be considered when you're working inside the park alone. And many years ago, we looked at the threat status at quaternary watersheds, and you can see it maps quite clearly over the major river systems. And although there's a large number of plants that were recorded in the park in this analysis, you can see there's still a much larger number of species occurring outside the park. So that pressure will remain in the long term, and we are very dependent on what management happens in those areas as to whether we're able to be successful inside the park. And this just gives a close-up view of what's happening right adjacent to us. So in some areas, literally within 500 meters of the park boundary, we have high-intensity urbanization. In some areas, there's commercial agriculture, whether it's sugarcane or citrus or other farming. In some areas, there's different land use types, from small-scale agriculture, pasture, and then further afield, commercial plantations. And as I've mentioned, these all have different species, and not only plants, although one thinks of plants when coming from these different land uses, but if you consider people living adjacent to the park, you keep a large number of different alien animals that have the potential to spread into it. You can see we're largely pressured from all around the park. Knowing that we have this large pressure around our boundaries, we actually went and looked at the boundary effect that we do have. And when we plotted the number of alien plants along the park boundary, we came out with a fairly clear pattern that within about 1.5 kilometers from the boundary, there was a very sharp decrease in plant numbers, and then it leveled off. So we showed that we can use this distance as a kind of filter effect. So if we could work and focus on an area around the park and a buffer, we could try and prevent some species moving into the interior of the park, or at least use this as a zone of surveillance and rapid response. So the question is, what species and how many species are we dealing with? So there are just over 400 alien plants that have been reported in Kruger, but this list includes species that are not invasive. Definitely, only a small portion of introduced species will ever become naturalized or invasive. And through a filtering process, we came down to 146 species that we think occur in natural areas, and some of them naturalized, which are species that occur in populations that are self-sustaining, and then a small proportion of those that are actually spreading widely, become very abundant, and can have impacts on the ecosystem or the habitat that they're in. On average, we've found that there's been about one species moving into the natural areas per year. But what was interesting was that since about 1997, there's only been about 20 invasive species. It hasn't really increased very much. But it doesn't mean that you need to have many alien invasive species to cause problems. if you think of a habitat like open water bodies, you only need to have one invasive that can have a big impact on that. But the point of this was just to illustrate which species are potentially the priority species. We then looked at where do these species come from. So, not surprisingly, South and Central America, in tropical areas and in some of the dry habitats match our climate fairly well, about 60%, and then about 20% of them coming from temperate and tropical Asia. So these are the primary donor areas of invasives into the park. Now I'm going to move into some of the management programs that we have running. And this is since about 2002, the grey areas and the lighter grey areas along the rivers, areas that have been worked mainly by the Working for Water program. And you can see there's been quite extensive areas in the south. Some of those larger patches include work we did on Apuntia, on prickly pears, and then some Parthenium areas. These are two species that I'll go into and show a bit later. And then also some large areas outside the park. The last couple of years, there's been a bit more of a focus on areas around the park. We know very clearly now the risk that's been posed outside the park, and a large amount of the effort is to try and prevent species coming in or trying to find new populations of these before they get a chance to move too far into the park. So to give us opportunity for surveillance and rapid response programs. For a number of years, we've worked on ornamental plants, and humans have an intrinsic interest in colorful plants, making their gardens or their environment pretty. And you can see this is quite clearly the case. These are plants from Kruger, in fact, in the past. There's very colorful vines, ground covers, small shrubs, and a number of species. And it's quite easy to see why people would like to plant them around. And in the past, there was perhaps not the same awareness or understanding or knowledge that some of these may ever become invasive. In the early 2000s, we did a survey to try and get an idea of what kind of species we were dealing with. And based on that, we came up with a strategy for managing ornamental alien plants across the park. And then in 2020, these villages and camps were resurveyed to see what the situation looks like now. This is just a graph that shows on the left-hand side, the number of species in the first survey, and on the right, in blue, in the more recent survey. And the bars are the individual camps or staff villages. And the two numbers at the bottom, 214, that was the most found in a camp. In Skakuza, in fact, of course, it's the biggest camp, the most people, so it's not surprising. And then in the most recent survey, it went up to 350. So within this graph, I'm going to break down into various categories. But overall, in the first survey, they found just over 230 species, and this went up to 438. So at first, this was fairly disappointing. It looks like the scenario is worsening, but there's a number of reasons for this, and one of them is the intensity of the surveys. And also, the abundance of a species may have gone down. So it's just one plant that's recorded doesn't equal a widespread invasion. So even though there might just be one seedling or regrowth coming out, it still gets listed. So it seems like those numbers are high. But definitely there were a large number of new species that overall that were found. Interestingly, just over 100 species were not seen again. So they either were removed completely or occur in very low density. Nationally regulated species refer to those that are listed in the regulations, the two main acts. And these went down fairly well. In almost every camp, it either went down or stayed the same. In some camps, the numbers of plants, some of those are absent completely. So that is fairly encouraging to see that we are achieving that. Locally regulated was based on a list of species that we were concerned about that occur here. It went down in almost all the camps, and in many of the camps, they in fact don't occur anymore. Unregulated just simply means new species or alien plant species that weren't listed in any of the other priority groups. And this is where we see the big increase. Overall, as I mentioned, there has been a large number of species increasing, but we still encourage that in some categories that we have been able to make some difference. We just now need to reprioritize and see where we stand with them. I'm going to highlight some of the priority plant species that we're dealing with now. And this, for example, is Parthenium. Some people call it famine weed because of the effects on agriculture and people's livelihoods outside the park. This is near Crocodile Bridge in a wet area. And along the Crocodile River, you can see the level of the density that it gets up to. And the team here trying to control the plants chemically. It almost seems like a futile exercise because the plants grow extremely quickly and produce many thousands of seeds. There's reports of between 10 and 20,000 seeds per plant per year. So it's a very difficult species to control. And this just illustrates the change. So in 2003, a number of roads were driven, the brown being the road surveyed, and then the plants recorded at the time. And then later on, you can see, so this is a combined map from 2014 to 2019, how the distribution just exploded. Fortunately, at this stage, most of the plants are from the Sabi River South, although we have found that there's an isolated population outside the park in the Shingweti catchment, and one or two plants found in the Taba and Shingweti very recently, but those have been removed. In an attempt to support the chemical control program, some biocontrol agents have been released at various points. Although the biocontrol does have an effect, it's not an immediate effect, and it's not going to completely wipe out Parthenium. The aim is to support the larger integrated control programs, and it's still fairly early on, so we haven't seen very large impacts at this stage. Our prickly pear has been one of our longest management programs. It was reported to have been introduced into Kruger in around the 1950s, possibly as an ornamental plant. Certainly in that era, the threat of ornamentals wasn't really as concerning as we now know the potential threat. And it's fairly widespread. These were the management units that were set up to do initially the chemical control program. In the earlier years, chemical control was applied. One of the challenges, though, is you have to go back at least on a 3-year rotation because the plants either regrow from seed or don't die completely and can recover fairly quickly. So in the 1980s, the late 80s, the Cactoblastis moth biocontrol was released. And this is a biocontrol agent that's known to be effective in many places. But unfortunately, it didn't give the level of control that was hoped for in Kruger. So another biocontrol agent was released, the cochineal insect, and in about 1996, and there were some really good successes with the cochineal. To the extent that we started mass rearing cochineal in Skakuza in a tunnel or hothouse, and then manually distributing the cochineal throughout the prickly pear range in the park. And I just have a few photos to illustrate how effective it was. So on the top left, you can see we released some cladodes with cochineal on it. And after about a year, the plant collapsed. There's still a few cladodes or leaf pads left. But if you go and look at them more carefully, you'll see that actually there is cochineal on them, and they would all die. The plant would be completely killed. And this was the regional release site in Skakuza in 1996, so late 96, and in late 97. You can see that entire population of prickly pear was completely killed. And the area re-vegetated itself or rehabilitated completely naturally. We didn't have to do anything. And if you go look in there now, you will most likely not find any prickly pears in this area. Or if there are, you will probably find the cochineal on them and impacting them already. Another well-known case was Sunset Dam. This had water lettuce on it for a number of years. And we released the snout weevil on the dam. And it took 6 years before we got complete control of this dam. So every winter or late summer, the plants would cover the dam, and then it would stay like that until spring. The population would grow, the dam would be completely open. And it went through this pattern for 6 years, as I say, and eventually it just stayed completely clear. And now if you look, you will possibly find a few individual plants around the fringe of the dam. So this is one of our most successful biocontrol programs that we've had. But these other similar cases are water lettuce infestations in the park that are not so easily controlled, and this is Orpen Dam. So it's also been there a number of years, and the early efforts were through chemical control, and it was applied at a number of intervals over time. The biocontrol has been released because we know how effective the biocontrol agents are. But one of the challenges is that this dam flushes out frequently, if not annually, every second year. So as the biocontrol agent numbers build up and it starts affecting the plants, everything gets washed away. The next season, the plants regrow from seeds, and then either we have to re-release the biocontrol, or if they're there, then the numbers start building up. So this is still a major challenge for us, Orpen Dam, because of this annual fluctuation. Hyacinth presents a similar problem, and this is Makati Spruit from the air where it flows into the Engelhard Dam just above the dam wall. And initially, chemical control programs were used and continued up until about 5 or 3 years ago. And obviously the plants are effectively killed through the chemical control, but it's costly and it needs to be reapplied all the time. And obviously there's other effects of spraying this, using pesticides or herbicides into the environment. But as with the water lettuce, the challenge comes in that the river floods quite frequently, washes everything out, looks good for a while, and then it comes back. And hyacinth seeds have been reported in literature to last for 20 and in some cases 25 years and still be viable. So even though the plants get washed out, there's still a large seed bed there and it can regrow quite rapidly. To support the chemical control program, biocontrol agents have been released over a long period. Some of the agents have been very effective and cause a amount of damage. For example, these water hyacinth weevils. You can see that there is damage on the leaves. And interestingly enough, even after floods, we will then find these weevils on the plants again. So they're moving in probably from upstream The populations seem to build up fairly quickly, and probably the main contribution that they're having is that they putting pressure on the plants. The plants are not growing quite as vigorously as they may. Fairly recently, a new biocontrol agent was released, megamelis, on the hyacinth at Engelhard Dam. It's known to be an extremely effective agent. It's been used elsewhere in the country, and there's some examples where it's had a huge effect on the plants. But we haven't had that effect now. It's too soon. And of course, the floods earlier this year disturbed that whole system. But we feel that this is potentially one of the best options we have. So we want to mass rear these insects and release them in high numbers. So I'm going to touch on some new species. So as if we don't have enough problems already, we have a whole host of species on that are spreading or on our boundaries. So water hyacinth has been in the park since the 1970s. We know it's been in the Crocodile, the Sabi River. But in 2020, it was found in the Sabi River, just upstream from Kruger Gate. And this is the first time that hyacinth, to my knowledge, has ever been found in the Sabi, inside the park at least, but in the Sabi catchment. What we don't know is where this plant originated from in the park, and how it got into the park. But it's now spread down through to Lower Sabi, and is likely to remain. There's no ways we're going to eradicate it from the river. A major concern is kudzu vine, which was found fairly recently along the Sand River. And this vine was already found growing up into the canopy. You don't get the full scale of it, but this is probably about 5 to 7 meters high along the river edge, and it was already rambling right up to the top. And that was in the Sand River near Skakuza, but what's the concern is we've now got records from fairly widespread localities. So obviously that means if we're getting these individual records, there's a very high likelihood that in between them there will be other individual plants, hopefully at the stage not big infestations, but still at a stage where it's manageable and we can try and remove them. And this is from Sidwala area. I believe it's one of the initial sites of introduction into Mpumalanga. And it just shows the potential for this plant. On the left, you can see how it's growing up into the eucalyptus trees. And on the right is actually in a riparian vegetation, and it's just growing over everything. So my concern is that along our river areas, because of the moisture, it might do very well. In the US, of course, this is a different habitat or ecosystem, but these just very nicely show the potential for kudzu vine. You can see how rapidly it regenerates within 1 year. It gets killed off there in the winter. And in the image on the bottom left, you can see it just smothers everything that is there. So the plant has a very big potential if the habitat is rooted in the park, and it can spread along the rivers. Barbados gooseberry has also been reported, fortunately not yet in the Kruger, and this is quite a big concern as well. You can see it's a fairly nasty plant. Once it's established, it's extremely difficult to manage or to deal with. And it's fairly close to the park's boundary already. Fortunately, at this stage, we don't know of any records inside the park, and we only know these records outside. I'm pretty certain there's more of it outside the park. If we zoom into that area, it's only 10 kilometers from the park boundary, and that red line shows how it could potentially spread down a stream. It occurs on a stream, and that then feeds into another stream that goes straight into the park. So there's a very high likelihood that if this gets away and we're not able to stop it beforehand, that it could enter into the southwest of the park. And we need to try and prevent that at all costs. In many of the talks that I gave it was focused on invasive alien plants. Obviously there's the largest number of alien plants, and we were spending most of the money and effort on plants. But in the last while, there's been a number of alien animals that have been reported in Kruger. And the first one is the common myna, and I'm quite sure this is familiar to everyone. And those coming through to Kruger have had you may have come across it already. So we plotted the records that we did have over the last 20 years. Now, this is just an indication. Of course, the data behind these graphs can be skewed. We don't know all the records. Some birds move in and out of the park, although some definitely are showing signs of becoming resident, and not only resident in camps, but also in natural areas outside. So we found records of birds going to dams or using nesting holes in trees up to distances of 40 kilometers from the nearest tourist camp or staff camp. So the main concern is where they seem to be showing signs of establishing, and they also seem to be adapting very well to the environment. In fact, you can see them feeding alongside cattle egrets as the animals like zebra and wildebeest disturb insects. Then they follow them around and actually seem to be quite happily adapted to feeding on them. The red claw crayfish was found a number of years ago already in the Crocodile River. But since then, it's been reported from a number of localities, and there's now some confirmed records in the Sand River outside the park. There's been a number of individuals caught there, and then also in the upper Letaba catchment, and potentially not too far from the Sabi River outside the park. So these have established. There's been recent surveys done a couple of weeks ago, and there was some more individuals reported in some areas. So these are definitely establishing. We move on to some fish. The common carp has been reported in the park, or at least on some of the boundary rivers. I'm not sure if it's established. These were just reports that we got. But the silver carp, we know, has established very well in the Olifants River. It's been in the Olifants in Mazangir Dam on the Mozambique side for many years, and pushes back into the park right up to near the weir, or just below the Olifants Rest Camp. So those fish are definitely established or invasive and in that area. Now, tilapia has been reported from some of the rivers for a number of years now. And of course, there's the concern around the fish themselves becoming established. They also have different behavior to some of the local tilapia. But one of the concerns is also the hybridization with the Mozambique tilapia. So resulting in the loss of the genetically pure tilapia species. And there has been reports of possible hybrid tilapia caught from nearby the Pobeni area of the park. So there are early signs now that this might be taking place. In 2019, bass was found also near Pobeni Gate, the first record, whether established in that area or perhaps established upstream or in Nyaka Dam and making their way down to the park. How far they will go into the park is not certain at this stage. It wasn't too much later than largemouth bass was found in the Crocodile River, coming in from potentially from upstream down, or in any one of the dams or streams that feed into the park from the southern region. Shortly after that, there were some reports of mosquito fish at Beluliwea. Whether the population is established, we're not sure, but there were a number of these fish caught there. So personally, I wouldn't have expected them to establish in an area where I would have thought there's so many predators that would have an impact on them. But to have got to that point in the park means that they have been able to avoid some level of predation and breed up to some level. This must be a very familiar fish to many people. It's very commonly used in aquariums. But the problem is when they get too big, then people need to release them, and they go to the nearest stream or river to set them free. And we got a record of one of these in the Crocodile River. Now, whether this was an individual fish that had escaped or been released and it was still surviving, or if there are others that a bigger population, we're not sure. But the fact that it was found there it is a sign of some concern. There's also a number of snail species, alien snails, the worst of which is the Cerebia snail. It occurs widely across the park, and it invaded probably only from the early 2000s. It's now found in many of the major rivers, and most likely by now in many tributaries and streams and other waterholes around the park. And one of the problems is just the sheer volume of snails that build up in an area. And with eutrophication and a lot of algae building up, it also suits them because it gives them some habitat or food. And I have seen many years ago walking along the Crocodile River, where it was like walking on along the coast, along the seashore, and walking on shelves, that there were so many of these snails. Many of you will have heard of the polyphagous shottle borer beetle. We have a project working with CropWatch Africa, where we have a pheromone trap monitoring network throughout the park with early detection surveillance program running. We've only had, and very recently, a record from Malalan at the gate. It was one individual. Follow-up surveys have shown that there have been no other of these borer beetles found in the trees or in any other sources around the area. But it's most likely at the stage of spillover from Malalan, where they possibly occur around the town. It's known that they occur in some of the farms around the Nelspruit area. Now, how abundant the insects are in these areas, we don't know, but these are just trap records from where they've been found. But it is wide concern, especially at this stage in the Western Cape, is one of the biggest areas of concern, and also around Gauteng and many areas. In short summary, if we're going to have long-term success, we're going to have many components pulled together in a multifaceted approach. There's no single silver bullet that can resolve all these problems. And this is not in any particular order, but we need to maintain the long-term projects that we've been running. You can see how much money we've spent on alien clearing and how much effort has gone into that. We don't want to lose the gains that have been made there. We need to increase the surveillance and the ability to have rapid response. Very clearly now with the Barbados gooseberry and the kudzu vine is key examples of how we need to be aware of that. Focus on the park boundary. We have a lot of information to show that these are some of the priority areas. And we need to increase awareness and education. But I recently read a comment by somebody that awareness and education is fine, but if it doesn't equal action, then it's not really achieving its aim. So we need to find out how we can move beyond just educating people and working into some programs that can have tangible outcomes. We'll keep working on the ornamental plant management program. We will definitely never be able to eradicate these species. Seeds regrow, plants regrow from tubers. So it's going to be a long-term project, but our aim is just to keep the numbers of species down to the point where we can feel that we have it under control. And then monitoring and detecting alien animal species. As you can see from this, many of the new species that we found are fish or other freshwater animals. So there's not a huge amount we can do in terms of managing them. But what we do need to understand is where do they occur in the park, where are they spreading, where are the threats, and over time try to understand what are the impacts that they might be having on the ecosystem and other biodiversity in the park. So with that, thank you very much.